there's a way to fund these things without potential challenges and conflict. Now, you would expect the Americans, being 10 times bigger than us, would have 10 times the resources in their think tanks, but it's actually probably closer to 100 times, if not 1,000 times.
Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Sabrina Maddeaux.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
Today, we're getting very meta and talking about the Missing Middle initiative itself. We're going to dive into the world of think tanks, what they do, how they're funded, and whether they're a realistic career option for Canada's young middle class.
And don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. So, Sabrina, I'm going to get very Gen X right now because that's what I do. You can tell I'm kind of dressed like Weird Al today, going full Gen X. And I'm going to talk about one of my favorite television sitcom tropes, which is having a character where nobody is quite sure what they do for a living. I think the most classic example of this is Chandler from Friends. Again, another sort of Gen X reference. Maybe if you're an older millennial, you might think your version is Barney Stinson from How I Met Your Mother, but it's a classic sitcom character trope. And while I don't have Barney's collection of suits or Chandler's sarcasm, I often feel like my friends and family have trouble figuring out, like, what exactly is it that I do for a living? You know, something involving universities and podcasts. They might even know the term think tank, but I don't think they have a really good sense of what I do all day or what a think tank even is. So as somebody who actually inhabits the real world and might be the most normal character on the sitcom we have here at MMI, do you think the general public knows what a think tank is or what we even do all day?
Absolutely not. I should say, I think most people or a lot of people have heard of the term think tank. So they're like broadly aware that this thing exists, but it's like some mysterious mythical beast that they don't have any more details about, and probably a lot of misconceptions in some cases. And I always figured that was the case, but also since starting the podcast and trying to explain to people the Missing Middle Initiative and even the Smart Prosperity Institute and how it all fits together, it gets complicated fast and most people just kind of glaze over. And yeah, there's definitely a lack of awareness there. So since you're the resident expert on this, obviously, I'm going to give you the opportunity to educate your friends and family along with our audience. What exactly is a think tank and what does it do?
Yeah, so roughly speaking, it's an organization that does public policy research on a particular topic and communicates that research to a variety of audience. So policymakers, politicians, but also the media, the general public, and so on. And think tanks are usually organized around an idea or a mandate, something that they're trying to accomplish, something that they can articulate about what it is and why it exists. So at MMI, our mandate is around policies to help the young urban middle class Canadians. And I think it's helpful to divide think tanks into two categories. The first is academic think tanks. So these are think tanks associated with the university or college. MMI is associated with the University of Ottawa. I've worked at three others, Smart Prosperity, which you mentioned, which is also at University of Ottawa, Moffatt Center, which no longer exists, RIP, at the University of Toronto, and the Lawrence Center at Ivey Business School at Western. So I've been doing this for a while. And then you have non-academic think tanks like CD Howe, the Fraser Institute, or so on, that they don't have a direct linkage to a particular institution, though they might have a lot of professors and PhD working for them or affiliated from them. I've worked at one of those, Canada 2020, and in fact, I'm still on the advisory board there. So they come in a variety of different flavors, but they're all around researching applied public policy and turning knowledge into actual policy and helping governments.
Mm-hmm. So let's stick with academic think tanks for now. What's the business model behind running one of those?
Yeah, so that's always a big question. Like how do the dollars and cents work? So, like, the value proposition of an academic think tank is it brings together academic researchers who do really important work, but it's not always that accessible. It's in academic journals, it's written a way that regular people don't really necessarily understand. But we can bring together that research along with the needs of industry, government, organized labor, and so on to help design public policy. So I'll give you an example of this. Classic case in Canada was around child benefit checks that both the Harper and Trudeau governments did a number of policies in this area. So the academic research is all around that this is a cost effective way of reducing poverty, that it has all these positive outcomes. So that's where the academic side comes in. The role of the think tank is basically to take that really academic work and design policy around that. So it gets into all of these kind of applied questions of, how often should the checks come out? How should those checks be related to other financial programs? How should those checks get clawed back as a family's income rises? How do you make sure that people actually get the benefits that they're entitled to? So all of these kind of wonky things, I almost think of it like the difference between physics and engineering, where the academics are the physicists who do all the kind of theoretical work, and then us at the think tanks, we actually have to design the thing, and we have to think about all these real world considerations. Going, okay, yeah, for designing a phone, maybe your toddler's going to spill juice on it, and how's the phone going to deal with that? Now, academic think tanks are run as not for profits, so they're not money making exercises, but they also have to cover their costs, so they're not for loss. And what I think people don't understand, I think one of the big misconceptions is they're typically not subsidized by the college and university.
Mm.
That the think tank itself has to pay for the salaries and benefits of everybody who works there, all the equipment they use, and so on, as well as overhead to the university to compensate the university for the costs they incur to keep us around. So, for instance, the people who work here might have to use the university library, right? So we give the university a chunk of change to make sure that the library can keep running. So MMI, we're typical in that fashion, where we have to pay for every single resource we use, including the salaries of everybody on the team, myself included, and pay overhead to the university. And there's no complaints there. The University of Ottawa treats us exceptionally well. They're great partners. But that's how it works. So basically, we operate as a not for profit, and we have to pay for everything. And we need to make sure that we have enough revenue coming in to cover those costs.
So, speaking of paying for everything, I'm sure the obvious question on everyone's mind is, where does all this money come from? So, Mike, where does the money come from for an academic think tank?
Yeah, and once again, I'm going to break things down into two different funding models for academic think tanks. So one is the endowment model, where you have some very wealthy benefactor who provides a think tank with a 7 or 8 figure sum of money. And then every year, the think tank spends like 5 to 10% of that endowment on a variety of activities. So basically, they're sitting on a giant pool of money that's invested in stocks, bonds, or whatever. And then they take the profits from those investments, and that kind of funds the activity. The Lawrence Center, where I was briefly interim director, that's how it ran. The center was created through a very generous donation from Jack Lawrence and his family about 25 years ago, and that funded most of the center's annual activities. But that model is the exception, not the norm. Most think tanks operate like missing middle. We don't have an endowment. We exist on a combination of grants, project-based funding, and so on. Now, this can come from a variety of sources like charitable foundations, governments, corporations, what have you. For MMI, our budget's under $1 million. So, we're a fairly small organization. Half of that comes from charitable foundations. Actually, over half comes from charitable foundations like the Clean Economy Fund. Our biggest single funder is the Neptis Foundation, which generally funds this podcast and other initiatives. So big shout out to our friends at the Neptis Foundation who make all of this possible.
Now, what's the single biggest misconception people have about think tank funding?
Well, I'd go back to that people think that we're funded by the university or college, that that we're basically being subsidized. And it's not true. If anything, we generate revenue that we give to the university. So we are We are a revenue center for the university, not a cost center. But I think the biggest misconception that people have is that there's a way to fund these things without potential challenges and conflicts. Like there's some pool of money out there that we can draw from that doesn't come with challenges, right? That any pool of money we get, any kind of funding we get, there's always the danger of being pushed into something that could either be a conflict of interest or appear as a conflict of interest. And it makes it the most one of the most challenging environments to deal in with fundraising, that there are no non-controversial funders. There's none. And I think people get this wrong, where progressives will often say, well, obviously you shouldn't take money from corporations and you shouldn't take that kind of money. You should just be taking foundation money. You go, okay, yeah, but foundations are funded by like the 0.0001%, right? So that creates potential challenges. Or, again, if based on an endowment model, that creates problems there. Whereas conservatives might say, well, you shouldn't take money from government because, that might make you beholden to government. It's like, okay, well, then you're probably going, okay, let's take that off the table. Then that funding comes from corporations who, might want to kind of dictate the research a little bit. So you're always having to be on guard where you're protecting your independence, because there is no way to operate a think tank without issues of where do you get your funding and who are you answering to coming up. It's probably the biggest challenge we deal with.
Yeah, that's pretty tricky. So, if all sources of funding are potentially problematic, how do think tanks ensure they're not getting quote unquote bought by their funders?
Yeah, and this is such a challenge. And there's basically three ways that I think about it. The first is like know who you are and what you do, and make it clear to the world who you are and what you do. So, kind of set a sandbox for yourself and going, okay, this is how we see the world. These are the policy issues that we deal with, and don't go outside of that sandbox. Because if you set a clear vision on what an organization is about, the problem they're trying to solve, and so on, then a potential funder, we call them supporting partners, a potential supporting partner isn't going to come to you in the first place, right? Where like a supporting partner isn't going to come to us and say, hey, I want you to work on, some issue around, capital gains changes for billionaires. It's not what we do. It's not within our sandbox. So we don't have to kind of worry about those things, because we know who we are, we know what we do, and potential partners know that. So that creates a set of alignment from the outset. The second is don't be overly reliant on a single source of funding. I mean, this is so important, and this is one area that think tanks can get themselves into trouble. If you have one big funder who's funding the majority of your activities, it gets really hard to say no.
Mm.
So we believe in a diversified funding model, and that's not just diversified in the sense of having more than one, two funders, but also different sources, right? So we work with government, we work with corporations, we work with foundations, and so on, because we see that as being important, and that creates kind of a natural balance where we kind of have to stay on the straight and narrow, because if we start moving too far in the direction of the interest of one supporting partner, our other supporting partners are going to be like what the heck are you doing?
Yeah.
Like, we work with both environmental groups and people who build homes, and that kind of forces us to be on the straight and narrow. And I think that is so important. And the third thing, and I think the most important thing you have to do, is set expectations very early. When we talk to a potential supporting partner, whether they're coming to us or we're going to them, we make it very clear that we retain full editorial control of all the products we release, all the research we do, and so on. We put very strong language in all of our communications on this. And it scares off funders. It scares off supporting partners. But my view is, if they're going to be scared off, I want them to be scared off in the front end.
Yeah.
I want them to go away before we start working with them. rather than getting halfway through a project or near, we're about to release a project and the supporting partner goes, oh, we're not comfortable with it. Sorry, it's what you signed up for. So, at the end of the day, I think it's making sure that you have alignment with your supporting partners, that you all have the kind of same vision, and you make it clear where the lines in the sand are. And we should recognize at the end of the day, like if you want to get rich by, being buddy buddy with corporations, this isn't the place to do it. Like you would make so much more money in other in other types of government relations jobs. And I don't want to suggest for a moment that we're suffering here or we make low incomes. We're searchable on the sunshine list, so you know exactly what's going on with us. If you're looking to be rich, selling out to corporations or endowments or whatever, this is not the place to do it. You're just the money isn't there. So this is the kind of place you go to for the love of the work, not to get rich, and that certainly helps as well.
So if you're a young Canadian thinking, a think tank sounds like it could be an interesting place to work, where do you start? Like, what do jobs for young people look like at think tanks? How do you get hired by one? Can you actually make a good salary doing this type of work?
You can absolutely make a good living doing it. You can pay the bills, and I think the most important thing is you can do something that really matters. Like the really coolest thing about this job is that when you work on some piece of public policy research and then governments actually do it, right? So we saw
hmm
that when we did a lot of work on eliminating the GST on purpose built rental, and then the government went and did that. I had in previous jobs I'd worked on, the child benefit checks, and governments went ahead and did some of those reforms. So, that's really fulfilling to see. The challenge is that the Canadian ecosystem for think tanks is small. So there's not a lot of jobs out there. It is very relational. So it's, getting to know the research, getting to know the people who do it. But there's various pathways where, a lot of the people that we've hired have worked for a government before. They might come from an academic background. They do a few years in federal, provincial, municipal government, what have you, and then go, I'd rather be on the outside. So it's that kind of thing. It's often we're not somebody's first job, but we can often be somebody's second job. So I do think it's a great place for young people. There's not that many jobs in the ecosystem because it's so small, and I wish we had a lot more. I truly do, because I do think it creates so many great opportunities for people in their 20s and 30s.
For sure. Now, one of the complaints that our producer Meredith often has is that the vast majority of great think tank work she sees comes from the US rather than Canada. Do you think they're really that much better at this than us? And if so, why would that be?
Yeah, they are, and that pains me to say as a proud Canadian, they are, and it all actually comes down to money. Now,
Yeah.
you would expect the Americans, being 10 times bigger than us, would have 10 times the resources in their think tanks, but it's actually probably closer to 100 times, if not 1,000 times. Like
Wow.
I think if you took, yeah, it's massive. So if you look at like the Brookings Institution, one of the big U.S. think tanks, I suspect they are bigger in terms of sheer headcount and revenue and expenses than like all the Canadian think tanks put together, or maybe the 20 or 30 biggest Canadian think tanks put together. Like it's that kind of scale. We just don't have that culture here where, we don't have those wealthy benefactors who see the value in think tank work. Our corporations in general have, it's not been something that they've been interested in. The foundations have been a little bit, but because foundations are interested in certain topics, that does tend to bias the system towards certain topics. Canada has a lot of really great foundations when it comes to the environment, for instance. So we kind of punch above our weight when it comes to environmental think tanks, in part because we have so many great environmental foundations. Not quite to the same extent, but we do have some foundations that are focused on poverty reduction, and that helps fund think tanks devoted to that. But the kind of work that we do, or other kind of socially important work, if the corporations, the wealthy benefactors, and the foundations aren't interested in it, then there's really not an ecosystem for it. So yes, the Americans are better than us at it, but it's a sheer resource difference that drives that. And I suppose a culture difference, because that the lack of a think tank culture means that we're just not getting that revenue that they see in the United States.
That makes sense. It all comes down to money at the end of the day. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening, and to our producer, Meredith Martin.
And if you have any thoughts or questions about working at a think tank, please send us an email to missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.